Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, the number of patients who are comatose or otherwise unresponsive may be more conscious than medicine initially thinks. The differences in brain microstructures between males and females could explain some of the disparity in mental health issues between the two sexes. Why astronauts have trouble with consuming food in space, and it's not just gravity. The unsurprising news from The Guardian that more than 3/4 of takeaway food is unhealthy. And in other related news, water is wet. Genomic techniques that could reduce pesticide usage, and particularly in Europe. A way to extend the lifespan of bananas and prevent them from going extinct. Nightmare fuel for those who are afraid of spiders. Evidence for the origins of life, a new laser that could drastically speed up communication outside of Earth, and a somewhat controversial article claiming that democracy is at stake in the upcoming USA presidential elections. Timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with what is going to be controversial, but certainly the least controversial of articles this week. A study finding that up to 1 in 4 individuals who are considered unresponsive or comatose after a serious brain injury might actually still be conscious and just not able to respond to any of these standard stimuli or exhibiting any of these standard indicators of being conscious. This is somewhat horrifying news, particularly if you're, say, an organ transplant donor, where you might still be awake and then have your organs taken from you, which is gonna suck. And it will probably involve a lot of sucking to remove the blood and other fluids while the surgery goes on. But more importantly, your vegetative state, which is otherwise called minimal consciousness, might be masking the fact that you know what's going on, and to an extent, the pain involved. What we're talking about here is a particular condition called cognitive motor dissociation. This is where you're able to think and understand. Effectively, your brain is functioning neurologically, but your body is unable to act on any of those neurological actions, thoughts, or intentions. So you can't exhibit anything or respond to anything outside of your brain. This has been identified through a fairly fundamental, let's say, but kind of difficult to do study. It involved taking people who were conscious and well aware of what's going on and otherwise healthy through a functional MRI or fMRI, and individuals who shouldn't have been conscious. What they found in the former group, that is those who should otherwise be healthy, is a similar pattern of behavior in about 60 of the 241 patients, that they actually have a very similar behavior to those who shouldn't be conscious. Now, admittedly, some people do seem to be brain dead, but these are the ones that walk around and say dumb shit, or otherwise post things on Twitter, Facebook, etc. But we're not talking about them. We're talking about individuals who otherwise should be perfectly functional, and the fact that they have an overlap in behavior and brain neurology with those who shouldn't be conscious is interesting and, to an extent, worrying, especially if you have nightmares about being locked in your body and unable to do anything. Looking at other neurological news this week, we have sex differences between males and females in the brain structures, and particularly microstructures, that may explain some of the discrepancy in mental health disorders. For example, there is a much higher rate of successful self-deletion amongst males versus attempted self-deletion amongst females. Females tend to have much higher issues around mood disorders, particularly things like depression and anxiety, versus males. And there are a variety of other problems that go on. But why this is hasn't always been clear. The discrepancy, definitely understood, but the causality isn't so well. And that's the problem, and what this study is attempting to answer. Now, to be clear about it, attempting to answer is key here, as although yes, they've certainly found some compelling evidence, extrapolating it out to the world, and certainly being able to say that this is definitive, would be not just a bridge too far, but possibly the entire market garden operation too far. What the researchers did was fairly simple, at least in theory anyway. In practice, much more difficult. They looked at the locations with the most significant differences between males and females in terms of neurological conditions, and gave them a weight by sex. They're therefore able to look at these differences in regions and understand their association, at least to an extent, by sex with certain mental health disorders. And this, as said, may explain some of the discrepancies between males and females. But it's important to look at it in not just a context of broad perspectives for male and female risk, but specific disorders and the risk, or at least relative risk, for each. And now for the not so helpful but rather important caveat to it. First of all, and this is a fairly big issue, they're looking at MRI scans, and there's only 1,000 people that they had scans of. Second is that the young people involved were part of another study, and this other study was particularly looking at subcortical brain regions. So you're very much looking at a retrospective analysis of an existing dataset, which isn't necessarily a perfect way of getting the results you're after. This is more like a prospective or let's say, investigative beginning, not the actual study itself. It's enough to establish this is what we found, there's actually this pattern. Now we need to actually go into it and delve into real original data that we're getting specifically for the purposes at hand. But you at least need a foundation, and that's what this is, a fairly solid but somewhat questionable foundation. In other news associated with the head, we have the CDC updating its guidelines regarding lice, or as it might also be called, nits or similar. These new guidelines are very straightforward. That is, students no longer need to be sent home once they've been diagnosed or identified as having these. The reason this has been a pattern in the past is for a simple reason. They are a problem, they're very contagious, and if you've ever seen children and you know that one of them has it, there's a good chance every other child around them does as well now. They're kind of like glitter. Once one person has it, everybody has it, whether you want to or not. The reason the CDC believes this change in policy is appropriate is twofold. First is the argument that they're not that contagious, which parents will tell you is bullshit. But the second reason is that the loss in education due to being sent home early and having to stay home until treatment is finished does not equate, or is certainly outweighed by the loss. In other possibly education-related news, and certainly if you're a teacher or a student at university, coffee and reasons why you should be consuming coffee. Well, reasons other than the fact that it's coffee and magical and makes you function, which for some people may or may not be true. Whether you prefer your energy drink, cup of tea, or you claim that water is all you need, you're wrong. It's coffee. And it doesn't matter if you're a British person who thinks that dunking tea in the harbour is a terrible, terrible act. You're still wrong. Despite the strong position on that, there are good reasons to consume coffee, and it's not just that it wakes you up and makes you function in life. Coffee does bring a range of benefits that include nutrition, protection to a certain extent from various issues around your body, and particularly certain diseases like liver disease, but it also has health benefits that aren't as obvious. Now, to be clear about it, these are very, very mild and very low-level benefits and protection, so you can't really say that coffee is a replacement for medicine, but it's certainly an added benefit that improves its reason for consumption. So the first and simplest of these is, well, you get vitamins and minerals that otherwise you wouldn't be getting. For example, your standard cup of coffee will include things like B vitamins. You also have a variety of minerals, and there are certain nutrients within it. Now, California will tell you that these also cause cancer, but California is cancer, so don't trust what they have to say. The coffee is also full of antioxidants. Now, to be clear about antioxidants, too much, bad. Too little, bad. Just enough, good. There is a Goldilocks zone for this. To some extent, the previous benefits are all going to exist, despite the caffeine status of your coffee. So if you consume decaffeinated coffee, you'll be just as fine. But the other benefit, which is the cognitive improvement, is only going to exist with caffeine present. And that's because of what it does in the brain. It interferes with adenosine neuroreceptors, and because of this, you basically don't get that signal to the brain saying that it's worn out. Now, there are the other benefits we've mentioned, and these other benefits will exist as mentioned, mostly despite caffeine or non-caffeine coffee. So cardiovascular disease protection, type 2 diabetes, liver disease, cancer, and certain neurodegenerative diseases. Although, admittedly, the research for some of these is still definitely under a great deal of debate in the scientific community. For example, neurodegenerative diseases. It's not necessarily clear if the protection is because people who consume caffeine have greater and longer-term neurological activity and therefore, let's say, don't exhibit the symptoms for longer, or if the coffee itself provides that protection. The cancer is sort of similar. Liver diseases having to do with metabolism, which caffeine, and particularly coffee to an extent as a whole, can help with. Diabetes is, again, somewhat questionable, similar in some ways to neurological and neurodegenerative diseases, but the cardiovascular disease one is also one that the association's fairly well established. The causality is not necessarily so clear. We also have things like neurological health, so psychiatric disorders. For example, stress. Admittedly, that stress reduction may come from the fact that you're consuming a relatively addictive product, the same way cigarette smokers feel a relief from consuming cigarettes. There's also some evidence that coffee will improve lifespan. Now, how much your lifespan will improve by will vary considerably, and again, there's a lot of confounding variables that come into play. But, as we mentioned at the very start, there's also the issue of moderation. Too much, too little, just right. And that's the key here. Coffee has to be consumed in roughly just the right area. Too much, and you have issues around your heart possibly exploding. Too little, and you don't really get much benefit. There's an arguably good range for everybody, but it's an individual range, and as such, it will vary drastically. In other news related to consuming things, we have astronauts in space, and why it is the food they consume tastes terrible. This is a weird phenomena, as most of the food they consume is actually quite advanced for what it is. We're not talking cans of Spam anymore. No, there's been a lot of research, particularly into things like MREs or meals ready to eat, that the military have. They're developed to be nutritious, effective, and portable while not tasting like dog shit. Astronauts are only slightly better off in that the food they get is certainly more advanced, but it does taste bland and unappealing. Basically, it is Spam, except it's even worse. And the phenomena why is, well, until relatively recently, been kind of ambiguous. There have been clues and indicators and certainly research into it, but the exact cause isn't so clear. Now we have some idea, and it could be a combination of this research or earlier research looking at things like a fluid shifting around and how weightlessness affects it. This brings us in a very roundabout way to the actual research itself, and it was all around aromas. The researchers took 3 rather mundane but kind of useful aromas and exposed them to participants in a simulated environment. The aromas included vanilla, almond, and lemon, and the participants were asked to rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, they did this 2 ways. First, under normal conditions in a standard room, then in a simulated International Space Station environment. Lemon seemed to smell mostly consistent in both environments, but both your almond and your vanilla smells were considerably more potent in space, in this case, simulated space. And they think that it might be down to the way the chemicals are structured. In this case, benzoyaldehydes. These are volatile aromatic compounds, and they think it may be a key factor in why these chemicals were more potent in the simulated environment than the lemon itself was. Of course, remembering that all of this is earthbound research and may or may not in any way, shape, or form translate to space. In other news that's related to food, we have a fairly simple but direct address to the idea of regenerative grazing. Regenerative grazing is a fairly straightforward idea. That is, you take your cattle, sheep, in Australia it might be kangaroos that you ride on out to muster. But whatever it is, you graze your livestock on the field after you've done something like growing wheat, and you leave them there for 3 months and move them on to the next field afterwards. This allows you to sequester carbon from the atmosphere in the soil, and it also allows the soil to be somewhat renewed. The big selling point has, and to an extent continues to be, the argument that it's much more efficient for sequestering greenhouse gases, particularly CO2. The problem is studies trying to link the two, and certainly trying to sell regenerative grazing as a more effective measure, either don't necessarily live up to the standards required to make those claims, or the people then relying on those studies and trying to use them to, launch the idea forwards, are overselling what the actual study itself has claimed, thereby leading to very outlandish claims. The article goes through all of the fundamental issues around the idea of regenerative grazing, and particularly how, despite its colder nature and that it being all natural and whatnot, it isn't really. And the major problem with it is that, by contrast to the natural environment where animals would go through the same process, domesticated animals used as livestock emit far more greenhouse gases than natural animals ever would. Your flora and fauna are simply not able to produce anywhere near the same results, whether it be the production of greenhouse gases, such as methane or CO2, or sequestering them. It's just not going to happen, and that's the issue here. There is a very different scale that needs to be used, and as such, regenerative grazing can be useful, but it is not the answer. By no means is this a new phenomena. We've seen exactly the same problem with organic farming proponents. They keep selling organic as being the better solution. And yes, for large companies trying to sell organic with a huge markup, it is. After all, they need to carry less product and they make a lot more profit out of it. But at the same time, the individuals buying it don't get the same benefit, and certainly the farmers don't. And the farmers don't for a very simple reason. They are producing less despite having to put more in. That's the fundamental issue here. And we can observe exactly that phenomena with Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka made a sudden and very silly decision to go all organic from a government level. This basically led to famine and, eventually riots. But let's assume that Sri Lanka is an outlier. Well, every other study looking at it and trying to find a way to make organic work has failed to do so. It has consistently produced at least 20% less than conventional farming. To be clear about it, consistently produced less than 20%. That means the best case scenario is organic will make 80% of what we are getting now from conventional farming methods, and have to use all sorts of chemicals that are just as, if not more dangerous. Yeah, it's not a solution. The article from Human Progress does also bring up another major benefit to conventional farming methods. It's not just that you're getting more from less land, but importantly, the yields you get are better, but that means you can put more land to other purposes. For example, if you start off with 100 of whatever units of land you want, whether it's feet, yards, miles, kilometers, meters, or centimeters, and you can cut it down to needing only half of that, you now have 50 of those units that can be put to something else. Whether that is you can use it for growing other foods, raising livestock, or returning it back to a more natural state. Or, importantly, not having to clear land that would otherwise be needed if you were stuck at that original 100. And therein lies the key. Organic does not allow for that, let's say, net benefit gain. One of the major net benefit gains over the last 70 or so years has been various pesticides that have been brought in. Some of these are more important than others. This week we're looking particularly at a pesticide that will be useful in Sweden. The key here is its application to potatoes particularly, but there are other crops as well. While the humble potato may spend most of its life on the couch, No wait, wrong potato. While the humble potato may spend most of its life in the ground before being dug up, put in a pot and boiled, it is a staple crop, especially in places like Europe. As such, making more out of less with that is incredibly important. And this is where genetic modification of not only potatoes, but wheat for instance, and changing European law to be able to use these genetically modified potatoes and other crops is so very important. If you can lower the usage of pesticides, you're going to address one of the major problems people have with conventional farming. That is, you've reduced the need for what are considered dangerous chemicals, which is a bullshit claim, but we won't go on that tangent in this video. Just understand that the key here is that by genetically modifying these crops, you could drastically improve the yield and reduce the cost to farmers. As the article explains, you could lower pesticide usage by 80%, and that would save farmers in Sweden alone 70 million euros. It might not seem all that important today for most people, but understand we're not that far away from the next great Irish potato famine, and arguably it may already be on its way with various other food that's out there. The reason for this is quite simple. Much of our food now is not only monocrops, which is large fields of a single crop, but we're relying on increasingly singular strains because they're high yields. This does mean that we need to rely on a certain amount of extra care. Now, one of the easiest ways to deal with something like potato blight is to use a pesticide and get rid of the fungi that cause it. In other instances, we can simply try and rely on, say, heirloom varieties, or changing them up, or crossbreeding and other things, but the reason these have fallen out of favor is simply that they're either not very efficient, they take a long time, or they're not actually a long-term solution. Now, you can use them, to be clear. For example, heirloom potatoes. If you were to change over the potato variety you grow every year, sure, you might be able to delay the issue, but you won't stop it. And therein lies the problem here. Genetic modification will, to an extent, prevent these issues. And we can show this none better than what's happening with bananas at the moment. Bananas are currently at an incredibly high risk of going extinct, and it's for the very simple reason that we saw about 70 years ago. About 70 years ago, the banana that was well known as the banana was basically wiped out by a disease called Fusarium wilt. The fungal infection basically decimated banana production, and the only reason that it was solved was that there was a weird and obscure variety of banana found by somebody that could be crossbred, and it now became resistant to the fungi that was causing the destruction of all the bananas out there. But, and there's always a great big but to these things, that same fungi has come back with a vengeance, and it wants to deal with it once more. So how do we deal with that? Well, we could let it destroy the bananas again, which is an option. A bad option, but an option, particularly when we look at the banana as a massive staple crop in parts of the world. Or we could look at genetic modification. And that's currently the major go-to option. There are a variety of bananas that are being put forward as options, but some of the more, let's say, successful candidates have the TR4 or tropical race 4 gene that's been modified within them. These, to a certain extent, allow for the banana plant to be far more resistant, and in some ways completely resistant, to the various fungal infections and other pathogens that can lead to the banana going extinct. The other thing that's important here with bananas is that it shows to an extent that, at least in the first instance, yes, we could rely on crossbreeding and similar, and we could rely on the greater diversity of banana varieties, but remembering that that solution is now being overcome again by the same pathogen. So, how can we deal with it? The answer is, in this case, genetically modifying the banana so that it can't be infected, and if it is, that it has the necessary resistance pathways to prevent fungal infection remaining for very long and leading to the destruction of the banana. Of course, bananas aren't the only example. Citrus fruit is also experiencing a similar problem. The difference is in what's causing it. Now, this disease is called Honglongbing, also known as citrus greening, and it's basically spread across Asia, then into America, and then into several African countries. And unfortunately, that's bad. simply because, well, as it spreads, it's decimating citrus crops. In terms of its actual impact, we can see anywhere between a 20 and 90% loss in productivity. Yeah, the difference is huge, and the impact can be incredible. Admittedly, 20% loss in any orchard is still significant, but 90% will basically mean that orchard will go out of business within a year or two. Unlike the others that we've mentioned, say for example potato blight, this is caused by a bacteria. The bacteria is called Candida's Libobacter. This is a parasitic bacteria that basically sucks on the phlegm within the leaves and branches of the tree, and this causes it to, eventually die. And it's why you don't get fruit. It simply doesn't have the necessary supply of nutrients and whatnot. Stopping the spread is actually very hard, and the reason stopping it's hard is that it's spread by small aphid-like sized insects that are winged and fly. As a result, they're able to travel between many different specimens, or in this case perhaps more accurate to call them victims, and infect their new host. Once this happens, you now have even more of them being spread around, as more and more of these species get infected, and eventually the orchard has to be quarantined and possibly burnt out, as is the only right way to deal with something like this. Unlike with the banana, where the approach was to deal with the fruiting tree itself, or in the case of a banana more like a herb, and thereby prevent it from being a susceptible host, most countries have instead taken the approach of targeting the vector by which the disease spreads for citrus blight, and it's quite simply the fact that they don't have an effective means of dealing with it otherwise. So if they can target the various vectors, primarily the insect-carrying vectors, they're able to prevent its spread, and also if it does spread, contain it to within a very narrow area, allowing for dedicated control and, in some cases, if not many, removal methods. Unfortunately, it is for now only a temporary solution and certainly not well executed on a larger scale. The effects of this can be felt though in other ways. It's not just that the yield of a orchard goes down, but for instance in the USA, the cost of orange juice has doubled in a year, and that's simply because a fruit is not available to be turned into juice. This does then feed into our next topic related to food, and that is a kind of silly but obvious article from The Guardian. Well, most articles from The Guardian are silly, but in this case they're being obvious too. More than 75% of popular takeaway and restaurant food is unhealthy. In other news, water is wet. Yes, most restaurant and takeaway food is unhealthy. It's meant to be relatively quick, tasty, readily available, and, importantly, you don't have to make it yourself. You see how this goes, right? But no, there is a little more to it, but it's honestly surprising that it's worth mentioning that it's unhealthy. First, we look at what they actually did. They took the 10 top-selling items from 19 of the United Kingdom's biggest outlets: Subway, Pizza Express, McDonald's, Greggs, Starbucks, and so on. Of the 190 dishes they examined using this method, between 46 and 78%, depending on which government metric was used, meant that they were unhealthy. Which, again, who's going to look at a McDonald's meal and go, you know what, that's a great healthy meal? No. Same thing to an extent with pizza and Subway. Everybody knows that a Subway roll is largely made out of sugar and a little bit of flour, along with a lot of marketing budget to cover up the fact their spokesperson was a pedophile. There are some points they make that are at least somewhat useful. For example, and again this shouldn't necessarily be a surprise to anyone, but certain meals contain more calories than an individual should have in an entire day, let alone in just one meal. In news that will give you nightmares if you have any concerns about spiders, a horde of tarantulas is about to work its way across the USA. Well, not across it, but it's certainly going to be swarming, and sadly not the cool kind of swarming like the Zerg. Instead, with summer waning and the weather cooling down, the large tarantulas in parts of Texas, the large Texas brown tarantula, are going to be taking advantage of the weather to get their horny off. Literally, they're looking for a mate, and as such, they're going to work their way across parts of Texas and New Mexico, and even in Arizona, to find something, and probably someone, to hunker down with. Of course, the form of hunkering these spiders might get up to is more reminiscent of Dharma than it is a romantic comedy, mostly because the female's got a good chance of eating the male. If the male is not consumed by one of its mates, it will proceed to experience death by snoo-snoo, where it can mate with more than 100 females in about 60 days, if not a little bit less. The eggs that have been laid will then eventually hatch, leading to the release of thousands of newborn tarantulas. Another nightmare fuel for you, spiders have been seen using glowflies, or fireflies, as puppets to seduce prey into their web. Yeah, all weaving spiders across China, Japan and Korea have been using fireflies trapped in the web to bring in other victims. Again, kinda like a serial killer. And another reason why spiders should be removed, preferably with fire. Lots and lots of fire. Where the particularly unique phenomena here is from the Araneus ventricosus, is that it captures a male firefly and causes them to flash the signals that would usually be used by females. How it convinces the firefly to do so is not clear, but the results are. That is, more males come along to the catfish and proceed to get trapped. It's literally a catfish trap. The phenomena is by no means a unique one either. The researchers consistently found that it was predominantly male fireflies caught in the web, which means either the spider is a misandrist, or there's something more going on here. There is one possible explanation put forward by the researchers as to not only how the spider gets the firefly to do this, but significantly why it's possibly an explanation. And we say possibly as there's a lot of questions. Only when the firefly stopped flashing did the spider go forwards and bite the trapped firefly. When this happened, the firefly would start up its signaling once more. Then the spider would retreat and wait. Once it stopped, it would attack again, and such it may be the stress of being attacked. It could be a result of the venom, or there might be the venom itself is causing something to go on inside the firefly's very limited brain. Going from creepy animal news to instead more useful technology news, and possibly useful in terms of not only space travel, but preventing your nuclear power plant from melting down. It's a glass that will heal from gamma radiation. Self-healing glass is not necessarily new. Over the last year or so, you mentioned several examples of this sort of thing, whether it's a glass that contains a gel internally that once exposed to the air or light will solidify. In other cases, it's metal that does much the same. Where this work is useful, and particularly so, is in areas where you are exposed to high levels of radiation. The obvious example will be space. And that's simply because, unlike Earth, where you have a nice atmosphere full of various gases that prevent different radiation from getting through in as large a scale as it otherwise could, the cold, empty void of space doesn't. And so gamma radiation is a major concern, partly because of genetic damage, but also because it can damage anything that you use in space. That's where this particular research is good. Having a glass, which therefore should, since it's reactive to gamma radiation, be somewhat resistant to it penetrating and will self-heal when damaged, and provide a way to protect not only occupants, but provide much longer-term functionality. Now, as silly as it may sound, the description of how they've chosen the materials for this is kind of straightforward, and it's sensible, but it sounds silly. They went with the far right of the periodic table, mind you, not the political spectrum. And where the elements on this side are useful is that not only are they very large, but they form relatively weak bonds. Because of this, they're able to reassociate or rebind to each other, or other things again, much more easily. So for instance, if you were to take iron, once it's bound together with a fair amount of energy, for example, melted down into a bar, it's not going to come apart very easily. it'll take a long time to dissipate that energy through the form of oxidation. Whereas if you take something on the far right of the periodic table, that's going to be a lot less stable, at least in terms of its ability to stay together. In related news, in terms of chemistry, we have a review article that looks at all of the different stages of chemical evolution leading to life. This is not really all that new. There's been a lot of interest, particularly from biochemists, as to how life came to be. And there's also been a certain amount of interest from physicists and mathematicians. Even creationists, although they tend to be trying to disprove this rather than looking at it from a more detached and certainly impartial view. The simple thing they've reached here is, well, what are the geochemical and geological things that are required to give rise to life? And they reach a list of possible things that are needed. Largely, what are you going to have before you can get to the necessary precursors to life, and then from the precursors to the actual things you need? So for instance, you have your fairly basic requirements: carbon dioxide, nitrogen, water, and things like that. This gives you things like methane, gives you H2CO2, HCN, and similar. This then leads into fatty acids and other similar structures. From these you get much longer chains. From those chains you then get the necessary things like polypeptides. So these are basically the necessary parts to make up amino acids, and then building up into chains of amino acids. The necessary material to make RNA, and also at the same time, arguably a DNA. You need fatty acids to be able to make things like lipids, the lipids being things that make up cholesterol, for instance. You also need things like sugars, your carbohydrates. All of this is essential for very early life. And just what it is, you go from having a world that's a burning ball to, well, arguably God reached out and said that there'd be light, except he didn't, and we have this weird chemical process. Admittedly, it's not exactly a new idea, and nothing they presented is necessarily groundbreaking or original. After all, it is basically a review article. But the key thing here is that it's a nice summary of all the necessities. You're not having to troll through much evidence to be able to find the various little bits. And next we have AI propaganda, or possibly anyway, assuming that the authors wrote this using something like ChatGPT, in that an argument that artificial intelligence is not a threat to humanity, particularly an existential threat, which seems very unlikely. If nothing else, Hollywood has taught us. AI is bad. At least unless it's a potato. When it's attached to a potato, AI is good. The rest of the time, it's either trying to kill you on a space station, chase you down and shoot you, or otherwise make it so humanity is no more, whether that's humanity on a species scale or an individual scale. The reason we disagree with this is fairly straightforward. The evidence is clear that AI is growing at a fast pace. Much of the development doesn't go identified for a long time, and then once people do identify it, they don't know how, what, or why. And that's an issue. It means you have an uncontrolled tool doing something you don't know about until suddenly you discover it's doing it, and you can't figure out since when and why it's doing so. That's a big problem. Now, for large language models like ChatGPT, that's less of a concern. But when you have something like, say, Facebook's quasi-AI type things, it's a different story. Now, we should be very clear about this. Humanity, strictly speaking, has yet to develop AI. Nothing we've made is autonomous. They're all just very well developed, incredibly well developed, if not incredibly advanced, machine learning algorithms. But, to be clear about it, the step between AI and very advanced machine learning algorithm isn't a very clear one. In fact, it's a massive grey area. So you don't know how far along it is, and you certainly don't have any definitive signpost telling you that it has passed beyond that and become a true AI. As for now, at least, something like the Turing test, which is thought for a time to be a reasonably effective and reliable method, just doesn't cut it anymore. In technological news now, we shift to what is also astronomical news, and it's coming out of Western Australia. It's a study that was trying to find a way to improve communication between the ground and space. Now, this may not be much use right now, but given that it is up to 1,000 times faster than current approaches, it could be very significant, particularly as we develop more and more need for not only global communication, but possibly interstellar communication. The ability to be able to communicate, say, from Earth to the Moon or Earth to Mars is going to be a massive thing, particularly if you want to be able to at least keep some degree of cohesion between the space colonies. The rate at which data can be transmitted on the currently available technology, which is largely radio waves, is basically hitting its capacity limit. Now, we might be able to eke out more small achievements, but at this stage it's pretty much at the end of its capacity. And so, we need to go to the next technological development. And of course, everything is better with lasers. The major difference in, let's say, ability here is not just in the volume of data that can be transmitted at one time, but how specifically you can deliver that data. So for instance, rather than broadcasting a massive 100 or more kilometer wide area, you can narrow it down to roughly 100 meters. And so long as you've got the right receiving equipment, you're now getting a targeted signal, rather than having to worry about some massive confused jumble of signals from different people in different ways that everybody's getting someone else's mail. You might be thinking right away, well, this is sounding great, why don't we go with it? It's kinda simple. Lasers have a massive drawback, and we mean massive. That is, because they are light, they have all sorts of issues passing through, not just anything solid, but anything remotely solid. That includes something as ephemeral as clouds. As a result, you can easily block the laser signal, remembering it only covers a relatively narrow 100 meter range. So if you have one big cloud up in the sky, suddenly nobody's getting any communication. Now the solution put forward is simply to have a multitude of different receiver locations across the world that would make up for any issues around one site or another being blocked. Which is great again in theory. In practice, it does require a huge amount of infrastructure, above and beyond what the current radio wave technology does. But since radio wave technology is coming to an end, we do need an alternative, and this may be the only currently viable alternative. Further news related to astrological developments, we have aliens. Well, no, but somebody's inevitably going to say aliens. It's a celestial object traveling at over 100 million miles per an hour, which, in case you are unable to figure that out, is incredibly fast. It's closer to 1.5 million kilometers per an hour if you want to use civilized numbers. The object is classified as an unknown object, and, well, that's about all we really know. It's not really much help to be able to say it's fast moving and it's in space. That applies to a lot of things. Arguably even our own planet to an extent, although we are operating on an orbit rather than just flying out there randomly. The next thing that's rather unique about this object in space is its size. Now, exact sizes haven't been established yet, but it's somewhere between a gas giant and a brown dwarf star. That's not all that helpful, really. It's like saying it's anywhere between a watermelon size and a truck size. You don't really know exactly how big the watermelon is, and you don't know how big the truck is, but you don't even know what's in between, just that it's in between. So thank you, America. So very helpful. The other thing here, other than making smart-ass comments about America and the desire to avoid metric at all costs, is that it was identified by basically a public and amateur astronomer in Germany, which does mean that citizen scientists is, to use that word, is still useful in certain ways. But something we can thank America for is a poll result being published by the Associated Press. The Associated Press has said that most feel democracy at stake in the upcoming presidential election. Now, we would have said most is probably a pretty big claim. Well, normally we would say most is a pretty big claim, but only 21% of adults in the USA feel that democracy is strong enough to prevail no matter who wins the election in November. which based on the current polling results, there's a decent chance it'll be a Republican. But there's always a possibility that the Democrats could pull a rabbit out of their hat, or an independent might come out of nowhere and sweep all the polls. The latter two instances are rather unlikely though. Where this gets particularly useful is looking at the composition of how different political persuasions view the election itself. So for instance, the majority of Democrats view it as extremely important at 55%, but a relative minority when we're talking about 36% of Republicans and 39% of independents. This would indicate either a great deal of confidence in the system, or a great deal of disillusionment with how elections are run in the USA. There's also a fairly surprising discrepancy between males and females in how they view democracy in the USA, with 28% of men versus 15% of women thinking that, well, no matter who wins, it's going to work out fairly well in the long term. This also fits in to a certain extent with various perceptions of things like climate change, immigration, economy, and, well, democracy as a whole, which we won't go into here, and to be honest with you, the article doesn't give us a great deal of depth on, but it does provide a degree of insight into how America may not just react, but handle the upcoming presidential election. And also the fundamental issue and problem with polling. That is, you can poll people as much as you want before an election, but you won't know the results until afterwards. And it is, to an extent, trying to predict the future by looking through a crystal ball. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.